The Great Lakes hold a fifth of Earth's fresh water. 1,000 miles west, the reservoir that keeps Las Vegas alive just fell to a quarter full. The desert southwest needs that northern water badly, and it is never going to get a drop of it. Not because nobody has tried, and not because nobody has run the numbers. It cannot have the water because the law forbids it and the land forbids it, and the two of them together have built the tightest lock on any natural resource in the country. You can see what that scarcity looks like out west. Above Lake Mead, there is a pale mineral ring baked onto the canyon walls, more than 100 feet of it, marking the level the water used to reach before it fell. That ring is one side of the map. 5 lakes sitting full and blue on a northern border are the other side. The fullest fresh water on the continent is also the water no one is able to move, and the region everyone wrote off as the country's past may hold the most valuable thing in its future. Start with the size of it, because the numbers are the part almost nobody has straight. Lake Superior, just one of the 5, holds enough water to bury both North and South America under a foot of it. Every road, every field, every city across 2 whole continents standing under a foot of water, and all of it from one lake. Put the 5 together and you get a quantity of fresh water with no rival anywhere on Earth outside the frozen poles. Here is a way to feel that number. The Mississippi is the largest river in the country, and it drains about 40% of the lower 48 states. If you took the entire Mississippi at its normal flow and pointed it into Lake Superior, it would still take that river roughly 8 years to fill the lake up. Now hold that against the Colorado, the most fought over river in America, the river that supplies water to 40 million people across 7 states. Everything the Colorado carries in a full year, every drop it delivers to every desert city that depends on it, Lake Michigan simply holds all the time, year-round, without ever moving. But the strangest part is where that water actually comes from. Most of it is not this winter's snow or last spring's rain. The basins were gouged out by the ice sheets of the last ice age, and the water that filled them has largely stayed where it was ever since. On average, less than 1% of the water in the Great Lakes is replaced in any given year by rain and snow and runoff. The lakes do not refill the way a river refills. What sits in them now is closer to an inheritance, a one-time deposit left behind by the ice. Spin that inheritance faster than that 1% can refill it, and it does not come back on any time scale that means anything to anyone alive today or to their grandchildren. So why is a wet corner of the country a problem for a dry one? On paper, America has water everywhere. Rivers, reservoirs, underground water, coast to coast. The trouble is simple to say and very hard to undo. The water and the people ended up in the wrong places, and the gap between the two keeps getting wider. The rules that divide up the Colorado were signed in 1922, during one of the wettest decades that part of the country had seen in centuries. The people at the table looked at those unusually high flows and divided up more water than the river carries in a normal year. For a long time, that overreach did not matter because almost nobody lived out there. Then Las Vegas happened, and Phoenix happened, and Los Angeles kept on growing. Today, the river runs at under 13 million acre-feet in an average year, while the legal rights to its water add up to more than 16 million. The river was promised a way past what it holds, right there in the founding document, and there is no clean way to take those promises back. In 2022, Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the entire country, dropped to about 27% of full, and the federal government declared the first official shortage in the river's history. Then go east from the Colorado and you reach the Ogallala, the huge body of underground water beneath the Great Plains that irrigates a large share of the country's farmland. It refills at a fraction of an inch a year, and farmers have been pulling it out thousands of times faster than that for decades. In parts of Kansas and Texas, that underground water is already, for all practical purposes, gone. The Ogallala is worth pausing on because it is the closest thing the country has to a rehearsal for what a drained resource looks like once the savings run out. Like the Great Lakes, it filled over a very long span of time and refills at a crawl. Unlike the Great Lakes, it had no wall of law around it and no basin boundary anyone agreed to respect. So it was pumped on a first come, first served basis until whole counties watched their wells go dry. That is the future the Great Lakes states looked at, and it is much of the reason they built something the West never did. The West has no shortage of ambition. What it is running out of is water, and it is spending the last of its savings to hold on. So everyone eventually asks the obvious question. If the water is all up north and the need is all out in the desert, why not just build a pipeline and move it? Lay a map of the country in between the two, and the answer starts to draw itself. Water does not flow uphill on its own, and the ground between the lakes and the Southwest is anything but flat. To carry Great Lakes water to the desert, you would have to lift it over the high spine of the continent, the ridge of land that decides which ocean a raindrop runs to. That means pushing an ocean's worth of water up thousands of feet into the air and moving it well over 1,000 miles every day with no end. One big pump at one end would not come close. The job would take a chain of massive pumping stations running the entire route, each one burning power around the clock just to keep the water climbing. Because the moment the pumps stop, the water tries to run back downhill toward the lakes it came from. The energy bill for that alone is the kind of number that ends the conversation before it starts, and it would arrive every month for as long as the desert wanted the water to keep coming. And there is a second problem sitting underneath the first one. Oil is worth carrying across a continent because a barrel of it sells for serious money, so the pipeline pays for itself. Water sells for a tiny fraction of a cent per gallon. You would be building one of the most expensive structures in human history to move the cheapest liquid on the market. If it is sinking in that all that water is sitting right there in plain sight and still cannot be moved, then subscribe, because this channel is about the hidden reasons the map works the way it does. And share this with the one person you know who still thinks the West can just pipe its way out of the desert. People point out that the Mississippi is closer, and it is, but the Mississippi runs at the bottom of the country and the desert cities sit high and far to the west, so the same wall of uphill distance shows up again. Others point to the ocean and say, build desalination plants on the coast instead, and that is a fair conversation, but it is a coastal answer for coastal cities, not a reason to reach for the lakes. And there is history to lean on here. Other parts of the world have drained a great inland body of water to feed farms far away, and the most famous of those experiments turned a large sea into a poisoned dust flat within a single lifetime. The people around the Great Lakes know that story, and it is most of why the idea of piping their water anywhere lands so badly. The map does not care what anyone needs. It rules out the pipe from the Great Lakes on its own. Even if you could somehow afford to move the water, you still would not be allowed to. In 2008, 8 American states and 2 Canadian provinces signed an agreement known as the Great Lakes Compact. It does one thing, and it does it with unusual force. It says that water cannot be diverted out of the Great Lakes Basin. Full stop. There are a small number of narrow exceptions written into the deal itself, and we will get to those. But the default rule is a flat no. Any serious proposal to send the water outside that basin has to satisfy every one of the parties, all 8 states and both provinces, and a single objection is enough to kill it. You can watch how high that bar sits in practice. When a community that merely sits on the edge of the basin asks to draw a share, the request goes in front of all 8 states for review, and clearing it can take years of hearings and conditions. That is the process for a town you can see the water from. For a desert 1,000 miles outside the line, there is no process at all, because the answer was written into the deal before the question could be asked. And that is the whole difference between the 2 rulebooks. The West wrote its water rules like an optimist in a wet year, handing out a river nobody had measured properly. The Great Lakes states wrote theirs like people who had already watched a neighbor's well run dry and decided it would never happen on their shore. One deal was built on hope. The other was built on the word no. Now set that beside the Colorado. The rules for the Colorado were written a century ago, before satellites, before modern water science, before anyone had any idea how many millions of people would eventually move into the desert. That agreement is broken at its foundation, and the states that depend on it have spent decades in court and at the negotiating table unable to agree on how to repair it. The Great Lakes went the opposite direction. There, the water is more than a lucky accident of geography. It sits behind a legal wall built deliberately around it, backed by an older treaty between the United States and Canada that has governed the waters along that border since 1909. The people who want the water are locked out of the water. And that kind of wall, where one objection ends the whole thing, is exactly what the West never built around its own supply. If the rule is that water can never leave the basin, you might reasonably ask how any of it gets out at all. And the answer is that there is a single crack in the wall, and it has been there for more than 100 years. In the city of Chicago, at the turn of the 20th century, engineers did something that had never been attempted at that scale. They reversed a river. The reason they did it is grimmer than the feat itself. The city drank from Lake Michigan, and the city also flushed its sewage into the Chicago River, and that river emptied straight into the same lake it was drinking from. People were getting sick and dying from their own water supply, so Chicago made a choice that still sounds unhinged. Instead of cleaning up the river, it turned the river around. Engineers cut a canal deep enough to force the Chicago River to run backward, away from the lake, and carry the city's filth south toward the Mississippi instead. That canal is the one place where Great Lakes water leaves the basin for good, carried south and eventually out to the Gulf of Mexico. It was built long before the compact existed, so it was grandfathered in when the rules were written. And even then, the Supreme Court of the United States eventually had to step in and set a firm cap on exactly how much water Chicago is allowed to send that way. That is the tell about how tight the lock is. The one existing exception is old, its size is fixed, and it took the highest court in the country to draw the line around it. The other exceptions in the compact are narrower still, and every one of them is written for a town that sits right on the edge of the basin, half in and half out. One small Wisconsin city just outside the line spent years fighting for permission to draw a modest daily amount of lake water, and the request became a national argument before it was finally granted with conditions. It had to prove it had nowhere else to turn, promise to clean the water and send it back, and clear a panel where any one state could have killed the whole request. That is the scale we are talking about. A town on the doorstep has to plead its case for a small share. A desert far out west does not even get to knock on the door. It is worth being honest about what these lakes are and are not, because getting that wrong is exactly the mistake that leads people to underestimate the whole situation. The Great Lakes are not bottomless, and they are not steady. They rise and they fall. There have been stretches, some of them within living memory, when the water dropped low enough to slow the freighters and leave the docks standing high and dry. Anyone who has lived along that shoreline for a few decades has watched the water line move back and forth. If you grew up on one of these lakes and you have watched the docks sit high one summer and half drown the next, you already know this better than any map can show you. That is the mistake that trips people up. The water refills so slowly at that same rate of under 1% a year that treating it like a tap which never runs dry is the fastest way to ruin it. The lock on the basin was never about hoarding an endless supply. It exists because the supply is not endless, and everyone who signed that agreement understood that draining it to grow lawns and fill pools in the desert would be a one-way trade with no way back. And there is one last piece, and it may matter most of all for what comes next. The lakes are not landlocked. In 1959, the United States and Canada finished the St. Lawrence Seaway, a chain of locks and channels that connects the Great Lakes all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. An ocean-going cargo ship can leave the Atlantic, thread through a staircase of locks, and sail more than 1,000 miles inland to tie up at a dock in Chicago or Detroit or Cleveland. Sit with that for a second. These are cities in the dead middle of the continent, hundreds of miles from any sea, and a freighter off the ocean can pull right up to them on top of the largest supply of fresh water on the planet. Almost nowhere else on Earth has both of those things at once, and that combination is a big part of why this region became the industrial center of the country in the first place. Put all of that together and the country's map starts to read differently over the next few decades. For a long time, these lakeside cities were a picture of decline, and there is no point pretending otherwise. Detroit lost more than half of its people. Buffalo lost close to 2/3. Whole neighborhoods went dark, and that loss was real for the families who lived it. For 2 generations, that was the only story anyone told about these places, and the jokes wrote themselves. Nobody was moving to Buffalo on purpose, but what actually built those cities in the first place never went anywhere. The fresh water did not leave. The ocean access did not leave. The rail lines, the flat buildable land, the deep local habit of making and building things. None of it packed up and moved south. What changed was only whether the rest of the country needed what that region had to offer. For 50 years, the answer was no, because cheap land, cheap air conditioning, and relatively easy Western water pulled people and money toward the Sun Belt instead. That calculation is now running in reverse. Every year, the Southwest gets hotter and drier. Every year, the Colorado and the Ogallala have a little less to give. And every one of those years makes the water sitting up north worth a little more than it was. You can already hear it in the way people talk. Move to a lakeside city from the desert, and the difference is not subtle. Nobody yells at you for running the tap while you wash the dishes. There are no rules about which day of the week you are allowed to water a garden, no ring of dead grass where a lawn used to be. The abundance is so complete that the people who grew up with it barely notice it, the same way you do not notice the air you breathe until it is gone. And that invisible thing they have always taken for granted is the exact thing the rest of the country is now starting to run short of. The lakes themselves did not change. Everything around them did. The people who live on those shores have been telling this exact story in the comments under every video on the subject, and they tell it bluntly and without apology. You chose to build your cities in a desert, they say, and nobody up here told you to do it. Do not come looking at our water. Which brings us to who is coming for that water now, and it is something newer than a desert pipeline and much closer to home. The companies building the giant data centers that power the modern internet need two things in immense quantities: cheap electricity and cold water to keep tens of thousands of machines from overheating. And they have noticed exactly what everyone watching this video has now noticed. There is a region with more fresh water than almost anywhere else on the continent, sitting under a cool northern climate that helps with the cooling on its own. So the proposals are already landing on the shores of the Great Lakes, some of them the size of small towns, all of them thirsty. Picture a quiet town of a few thousand people on the shore of Lake Michigan, the kind of place where the biggest news all year is the high school football score. One morning, a company nobody there has heard of offers to build something the size of 100 warehouses just outside town, running day and night on water pulled from the lake. Half the town sees jobs. The other half sees the lake it grew up on turned into a coolant for someone else's servers. That fight is happening in real towns right now, and it is only going to get louder. One large data center can draw as much water in a day as a town of tens of thousands of people, and it does not draw it for a season and then stop. It draws it every day, forever, for as long as the machines are running. And unlike a farm or a desert city, a data center does not need to move the water anywhere at all. It just needs to sit down next to it. Much of what it draws for cooling evaporates away and does not return to the lake, the same slow subtraction the compact was written to prevent. That is the part that makes this different from the old pipeline dream. The compact was built to stop the water from being carried out of the basin. Nobody drafting it pictured the demand simply coming to stand on the shoreline instead. For 100 years, the imagined threat to this water was the desert stretching a pipe toward the north. The real contest is arriving from the inside instead, from industry that would rather set up directly on the water than try to move it. And that is the lesson written into this whole map. The most valuable ground in America over the coming century may not be the sunny coastline or the desert boomtowns everyone has been moving to. It may instead be 5 old lakes on a cold northern border, holding an inheritance left behind by the last ice age that the law says almost no one is allowed to touch. The water is there. The wall around it is up. And for once, the map is on the side of the people who already live there. For decades, the smart money laughed at these gray industrial towns and chased the sun and the cheap water out west. That map is flipping. The sun is still there, but the water under it is running out, and the towns everyone left behind are sitting on the one thing the next 100 years cannot do without. So here's the real question, and I would like to know what you think. When the fight over this water finally comes, who ends up in control of it? The cities that grew up on the lakes, or the industries now moving in on top of them? Tell me in the comments, and I will see you on the next map.